In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. One Saturday afternoon, well before the idea of cell phones even existed, my family was gathered at my grandmother's house as we usually did. And so we had a dial-up telephone. You know about those, don't you? When the telephone rang, my aunt instructed me to go and answer it. And I did. And the person wanted to speak to her. And after the usual greetings were exchanged, typically, in answering the phone, we would ask, "And whom may I say is calling?" So the person told me. And so I told my aunt who the person was, and she said, "Just tell him I'm not here." So guess what happened? I said to the person, "She said to tell you she's not here." Everybody started laughing, but my aunt was not amused. Apparently, I was simply supposed to say she's not here. I did not follow the instructions. How well do you follow instructions? You know, how often have you instructed your children or your spouse to do something, but they simply do not follow the instructions? When you ask your child to take out the garbage or to clean their room or to pick up after themselves, what tends to happen? Does the garbage go out? Does it make it to the door and then get abandoned there? Do they take, well, one child told me he takes about 2 hours and then he'll think about doing it this morning, right? But does the room get cleaned or does nothing happen at all? How often have you ordered something from Amazon that requires you to assemble it after reading the instructions? But before you read the instructions, you just start to assemble it without reading. Yeah, we do that. We don't follow instructions. Or how often have you had to give someone an order repeatedly before they got it right? So, last week, while I was in St. Martin, quite late one night into the wee hours of the morning, as we were coming from a jazz festival, from church praying, we stopped to Kentucky to grab a bite to eat because we were hungry. There were a number of us in the taxi, but 3 of us particularly, we were hungry. And I kid you not, while ordering, we spent 10 minutes just trying to explain to her what we wanted. We got to the window, and she proceeds to ask again, "I'm sorry, I did not understand your order. Could you please tell us what you want?" And so we spent 25 minutes ordering 3 two-piece meals with spicy and original. How difficult is that? Apparently it was for her. It took her a long time to get the instructions. And so no matter how we tried to explain, she could not follow the instructions. So eventually I instructed the taxi driver to just take what she gave us because I wanted my food back without a suspicious syrup on it. As I observed then, and as I did in the classroom many years ago, and in everyday life experiences, we do not always follow instructions well. We sometimes make things more complicated than they need to be, or we simply ignore the instructions. We speed well above the speed limit. We miss turns even when Google Map is instructing us. And I'm sure we can list a plethora of examples of how we make instructions much more complicated than they need to be. So my simple question to you: how well do you follow instructions? In the gospel today, Jesus appointed 70 people to prepare the way for his arrival. We know that the number 70 is important. It was the number of nations that the ancient people believed to exist on earth at the time. And so essentially what Jesus was saying to them is that the gospel is to be taken everywhere, to every nook and cranny of the world, and no single person would be left out. As he sends them out, therefore, he gives them simple instructions. Detailed, but simple. Yes, proclaim the gospel, but note several things. A, be careful. I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Don't get caught up. Be aware of the dangers. B, trust my provision. Trust God's provision and travel lightly. Carry no purse, carry no bag, carry no sandals. Jesus simply wanted them to focus on the mission. He wanted them not only to talk the talk, but to walk the walk as well. He wanted them to tell others about faith in God, but to show others as well what it means to trust in God. So carry very little with you. And the third instruction, C, don't be rude. Be hospitable. Show love. Offer peace and healing. Whatever is set before you, eat it. And I was going to say, now, Jesus, hold on. We can't. I'm not eating whatever's put before me. But it was a simple instruction. And he said, keep people accountable. When they reject you, simply take the dust off your shoes, shake it off, and move on. Let them know that we disagree with what is happening here. Simple instructions. There is much, dear friends, we can gain from this passage. Much we can speak to. Hospitality, greed, faith, and trust in God. All of these things are wonderful. But there is one thing that stood out for me, that struck me as I was reading this passage. Something that we might miss. It is simply this. We are called to proclaim the gospel everywhere and at all times. Not complicated, right? That's God's instruction for mission. And yet the church today at times is trying to be so creative that we, of course, run into challenges about what it means to proclaim the gospel. What is the church all about? What is our raison d'etre? What is our reason for being? It is to proclaim the gospel at all times, in all places. St. Augustine put it this way: proclaim the gospel at all times. Use words when necessary. You see, if you notice at the beginning of our service, there's something called the collect, right? And the collect is simply a collection of thoughts that we put in the form of a prayer that speaks to what the readings are about today. Anybody has the collect in front of them? Just read it aloud for me, please. Let's read that collect and see what it says. Instead of making what the reading is saying so complex, it's simply put in the collect. What does it say? That's it right there. Keep my commandments. And how do we do that? By loving everyone. See, the most effective form of evangelism we can offer is the way in which we live our lives. And that's the instructions Jesus is giving to the disciples today. By the example we set as Christians. As one priest said to me many years ago, the best sermon you could ever preach, Mario, is the way you live your life. Because people tend to pick up on actions more than what you say. People will not remember a lot of times what you say from the pulpit, but they will remember how you make them feel. Actions speak louder than words. And that's what Jesus was saying to the disciples. So we may achieve this task of proclaiming the gospel in many different ways, quietly or spectacularly, verbally or by loving care for others. But the task of showing Jesus to others is what we are called to do. And sometimes we get so caught up in thinking that God's instructions for his church are so complex, so complicated. But in reality, it's something very clear. The readings today offer clear instructions for our engagement in God's world, for our proclamation of the gospel. God's simple instruction for evangelism is not run several programs. It's not raise a bunch of money. It's be faithful. Be faithful, and the rest will follow. The details of how each of us lives this instruction will vary according to what each day brings. But the key thing is to be faithful. And what are some of the things that we may face as we try to be faithful in proclamation of the gospel? Well, he tells us right there. Some of us will face challenges like feeling alone. We will face times when we think we are alone. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Do you ever feel sometimes like you're the only one fighting to be kind, fighting to obey the law, fighting for your marriage, fighting to raise the children, the only one alone in forgiving? You're always the one who has to break the tension and say, I'm sorry. Always the one who has to try and make a positive difference. Sometimes in this Christian race, we can feel alone. We can feel like there is so much to do, and there's just me one. Yes, we can be alone and feel alone at times. Sometimes we may think that there is just too much work to do in God's mission field, and I'm only one person. There is no way my efforts can make a difference. And I often say to people, even though you may feel as though you're the only one being kind and courteous, the only one forgiving, keep doing it, because the impact will be felt ultimately. And if you don't think that you can make a difference by being faithful to God in your own small corner, in your own way, then think of what that African proverb says. It says, if you think you're too small to make an impact, try sleeping in a room with a couple of mosquitoes. See, when the 70 disciples returned and made their reports, Jesus said, I saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven. The 70 must have whispered to themselves, what is he talking about? We didn't see anything like that. Well, Jesus saw something they hadn't. We don't always see the impact, but God does. And he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much, and great is his reward, says the scripture. Some of us will face the challenge of materialism and get caught up in coins instead of character. And so Jesus says, don't worry about carrying bags and purses, etc. Let your character speak. Sometimes we will face wolves and be deceived. Sometimes others will reject us and the message of the gospel, and it will be tempting to give up. In other words, it will not always be easy to live and proclaim God's gospel. We face situations that seriously challenge us. And so, St. Paul tells us, let us not grow weary in doing what is right. Why should we be faithful? Why should we follow this simple instruction from God? The letter to the Galatians, the reading from which we read and heard today, says this: we have eternity to look forward to. God will not be mocked, and one day he will right all the wrongs of our world, and justice will come. But also, we reap what we sow. And if we sow seeds of love and kindness and compassion and hospitality and generosity, it will be returned to us. The 70, dear friends, returned filled with joy. You ask for joy, you ask for peace, be faithful to God. And he offers us a peace that the world cannot give. A peace that surpasses our understanding, that keeps our hearts and minds in the knowledge and in the love of God. It's not something I can explain or something that can be articulated clearly in words, but it's something I've experienced. That when we are faithful, there is a sense of peace that we have within. That is, dear friends, the gift given to us when we follow God's simple instruction. And so, I ask, as we leave this place today, what simple instruction is God giving you about how you are to proclaim his gospel? Maybe it is to go out and be a little more aware of the people around you. Maybe it's holding the door open for someone. Maybe it's giving a phone call to someone who you haven't spoken to in a while. Maybe it's changing some negative attitude. What simple instruction is God giving you this morning? May we leave here empowered with the daily intention of dedicating ourselves to follow God's instructions, to proclaim his gospel at all times, in all places, by simply loving others, knowing that God can make us strong enough to do God's will, strong enough to lift our cross, strong enough to get out of bed and follow his instruction. What's his instruction to you this morning? May we follow it and bring honor and glory to his kingdom.